He had a ticket. He had a seat. Yet with nothing more than a polite smile, his entire world was pushed backward. First class, the place that rightfully belonged to him, suddenly turned into forbidden ground. On flight AG417 that morning, the soft light from the windows fell across the front row, where glasses of champagne sparkled with bubbles, promising a paradise reserved for the wealthy. Just a few rows behind, the cold glow of a phone screen lit up the face of a man sitting silently. And when his finger brushed a single button, the air inside the cabin shifted, like a storm opening its eyes, ready to swallow the flight whole. That man was Ethan Cole, 46, CEO of Skyreach Airlines. But no one on board knew. In his simple grey suit, carrying a worn leather case, with calm eyes that betrayed nothing, he looked like just another businessman among hundreds of passengers. They could not see the fire beneath that still exterior, the fire of a man who had built an airline empire from nothing, only to be denied the very seat he had paid for on his own airline. Madeline Grant, the 42-year-old chief flight attendant, carried a soft smile, but eyes sharp as glass. When she checked his boarding pass, she paused for just the length of a heartbeat, enough for the light in her eyes to dim. Then her voice came, sweet but cold as a blade. "Sorry, sir, but seat 2A has been reserved for our VIP guest. Please sit in the main cabin for now. We'll verify later." Ethan did not react. He did not argue, did not pound his fist. He simply looked into those eyes that had already built a wall of prejudice. He had seen that look many times, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in places where people believed power lived in expensive suits and titles printed bold on a ticket. Standing right behind him was Richard Hawthorne, 57, a well-known businessman. He frowned with impatience. Richard was accustomed to 2A, treated it like his personal throne. "I always sit there. That's my seat," he muttered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. His words fell heavy in the air, like a verdict. Whispers began to spread through the cabin. A few phones were discreetly lifted. Clara Jensen, 31, a freelance journalist, had just cleared the boarding gate. Her instinct screamed that this small moment would unravel into a much larger story. She hit record. The lens captured a man with dark skin, wearing a grey suit, being pushed out of first class, with no real reason given, just the claim that this seat is for someone more deserving. Ethan quietly pulled his case and walked toward economy. His steps were steady, but the hearts of those watching pounded faster, because they could not understand why a man with a first-class ticket would endure silently. They thought he was powerless. They thought he was resigned. But that silence was not surrender. It was the choice of a man who knew exactly when to strike. In row 18, by the window, Ethan stowed his bag, folded his arms, and fixed his gaze on the thin curtain that separated cabins. A piece of fabric, yet to him it was the wall of prejudice itself. Beyond it, Richard leaned back, raising a glass of champagne and laughing loudly with his companions. The laughter spilled into economy, as if to remind everyone that just a few steps could divide two worlds. Ethan exhaled slowly. His finger slid across the screen of his phone, opening a hidden application. 3 words appeared. Protocol Orion. This was no outburst, no personal tantrum. This was an emergency mechanism only he, the CEO, had the authority to trigger when the dignity of the airline was at stake. One touch, one order sent. And in the operations center hundreds of miles away, a red light began to flash. Meanwhile, Clara Jensen kept her camera rolling. She didn't know who the man was. She only knew she had just witnessed raw injustice, and every instinct as a journalist told her she could not look away. In first class, Madeline still carried her smile, walking with the poise of someone who thought she had handled a minor issue. But in Ethan's dark eyes, that moment had carved itself in steel, not because he had lost a seat, but because he had just seen how false power could strip away true worth. Ethan Cole was silent, but that silence was not the end. It was the beginning. A hidden tide had been awakened, and Flight AG417 had no idea that the storm was already building in its cockpit. The economy cabin was thick with scattered noises, the click of seatbelts snapping shut, the crinkle of plastic bags, muffled laughter mixed with weary sighs. But for Ethan, all of it blurred into nothing. He heard only two things: the steady beat of his own heart and the distant murmur of first class seeping through the curtain. In the warm yellow glow, Richard Hawthorne leaned toward another businessman, his voice carrying clearly across the cabin. On flights like this, people need to know their place. A seat isn't bought with money, it's bought with the name behind it. Laughter followed, champagne glasses clinking in mockery. Each note rang like a chorus, ridiculing not just the man pushed back to row 18, but every invisible face of passengers denied their place for not fitting the image of a VIP in the chief attendant's mind. Ethan sat motionless, but beneath the calm exterior, each word carved itself into his chest like a blade. He knew this wasn't about him alone. Those men weren't just laughing at Ethan Cole. They were laughing at the dignity of thousands who had once been told they didn't belong. Across the aisle, Clara Jensen quietly adjusted her camera lens. She didn't take her eyes off the man who had been pushed aside without reason. She didn't know his name, his title, or who he was. But instinct screamed. This wasn't ordinary. This was the moment that could expose an entire system. Ethan's phone buzzed softly. A notification lit the screen. Orion activated. Data feed incoming. Hundreds of miles away, at Skyreach Airlines Operations Center, Owen Park, 34, leaned forward as red alarms flashed across his screen. The name appeared. Ethan Cole, CEO. And Owen's heart clenched. He pulled up CCTV footage, and his blood froze. There was Madeline, holding Ethan's ticket, her smile dimming, her head tilting coldly as she directed the CEO to economy. My God, not a system glitch. This was a choice, Owen whispered. Quickly, he clipped the footage, time-stamped it, encrypted the file, and sent it straight to the captain's secure channel. His fingers trembled on the keyboard, one thought pulsing in his head. The storm is coming. Back in economy, Ethan cracked open the window shade, letting the pale blue light of the sky wash across his face. Clara's breath caught behind the camera. Through her lens, she saw what no one else noticed. His silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of a man waiting for the right moment to rise. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Foster received the Orion alert. He froze, eyes locked on the clip Owen had sent. His jaw tightened, lips pressed thin. After playing it twice, he slammed the tablet shut. Without a word, he hit the intercom. "Madeline, meet me in the galley. Now!" His voice was iron. First class was still alive with polished laughter, but in the galley, the air shifted. When Madeline arrived, Foster was already waiting, arms folded, his stare sharp. "Explain yourself. Why was a valid passenger forced out of his seat?" Madeline hesitated, then slid on her usual smile. "Just a system glitch, Captain. Things like this happen sometimes. I figured a few minutes in economy wouldn't matter." Foster didn't blink. His voice dropped lower, but each word struck like steel on steel. "That wasn't a glitch. I saw the footage. It was your decision. And that passenger was Ethan Cole." Color drained from Madeline's face, heat rushing to her cheeks. She stammered, forcing a brittle smile. "The CEO? I didn't know." Foster cut her off. "Not knowing is no excuse. This was humiliation, and I will correct it right now." In economy, murmurs rippled as the captain himself appeared, his crisp uniform cutting through the aisle. Conversations died. Passengers shifted aside instinctively as he strode to row 18. "Mr. Cole." Foster bowed his head slightly. "Please, allow me to escort you back to your seat." Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting the captain's. He said nothing, simply rose. The aisle seemed to part by itself, passengers leaning away, holding their breath. Clara's pulse hammered as she lifted her camera. And then it happened. The image of the man who had been cast down to row 18, walking back toward seat 2A, escorted by the captain himself. No shouting, no accusations, just silence. Silence strong enough to shake the cabin to its core. At 2A, Ethan sat down, fastening his belt. Behind the curtain, Richard Hawthorne gripped his glass tightly, his eyes flashing with annoyance. Clara's hands trembled as she hit upload. The second clip went live. "Captain personally escorts passenger back to first class." Within minutes, both pieces of the story were out in the world. And as the internet consumed them, Flight AG415 became the epicenter of a storm no one could stop. Clara Jensen's phone buzzed violently in her hand. The view count climbed into the thousands within minutes. Comments poured in like a flood. "This is blatant discrimination. Who is that man? He's holding himself together in an uncanny way." Respect is not a privilege. It's a basic right. Clara bit her lip, eyes glued to the screen. She had covered protests, filmed scenes of injustice in the streets, but never had she seen a video spread so fast. No captions were needed. Just the image of a man being unjustly cast down from first class, only to be escorted back to his rightful seat by the captain himself. 2 clips, pieced together into one silent but powerful indictment. In first class, Richard Hawthorne leaned on the armrest, his gaze locked on Ethan. He was used to people lowering their heads, accepting his presence as something given. But now, Ethan's return had shattered that order. The champagne in his glass had lost its flavor. The laughter he had carried moments before was gone, replaced by an uneasy feeling that his invisible authority had just been ripped away from seat 2A. In economy, Whispers spread. People lifted their eyes from magazines, paused their laptops, turned off the movies playing on their screens. Every glance shifted toward the thin curtain. They didn't know who he was, but they knew one thing, that silence carried more weight than any argument. Ethan leaned back, eyes half closed, but his mind was far from resting. He thought of the early mornings in the maintenance hangar when Skyreach had only 3 old Boeing jets. He thought of the first employees, engineers, attendants, ticket clerks, who had trusted his vision that an airline doesn't just fly, it carries the dignity of its passengers. And now, with a single cold smile from a chief attendant, that vision had been torn apart. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Foster spoke with operations. Owen Park's voice crackled through the headset, urgent. "Captain, I've confirmed it. No system glitch. Seat 2A was valid, the boarding pass accurate. This was the chief attendant's decision. And he," Owen swallowed hard, "he is CEO Ethan Cole." Foster nodded sharply, though Owen couldn't see him. "Understood. Keep the secure channel open. Prepare a direct report to the board when we land." Outside, clouds gathered, the aircraft shuddering slightly as it hit turbulence. But the real turbulence wasn't in the skies. It was in the storm swelling across the internet. Clara's phone buzzed again. A notification flashed. "Civil rights attorney retweeted your video." Another. "Pilots Union rep. We are monitoring the situation on AG 414. And then, breaking news. Video of passenger denied first-class seat goes viral. Clara held her breath. She realized the story in her hands had grown beyond the reach of a single report. It was turning into a collective declaration. In the galley, Madeline Grant stood rigid. She kept the mask of a professional smile as she passed passengers, but her eyes betrayed the weight of fear. What she thought had been a deft handling of a small issue had now spiraled into disaster. Each step she took felt like walking on ice. Ethan opened his eyes, staring out the window. The sky outside was clear blue, but inside him, storm clouds gathered. He wasn't thinking of himself. He was thinking of the countless nameless passengers who had been brushed aside just as he had been minutes ago, but without the power or the camera to capture it. He knew this moment was no longer about one seat. It was a test of the culture of the very airline he had built. The plane shuddered again. A passenger whispered, "Something big is happening." And they were right, because from the moment Clara hit upload, a door had opened. And now, the whole world was watching Flight AG 414, where a storm of Escorted had just begun to form. The familiar noise of the cabin, the shuffle of luggage, hushed conversations, the faint hum of background music, suddenly felt heavier. There was something in the air, as if everyone could sense a secret slowly being revealed. In row 22, a student opened Twitter and gasped. "Hey, look at this! This is our flight!" The screen glowed, showing the very video Clara had just posted. The murmur spread quickly, like furor across dry grass. Passengers who had been indifferent moments before now craned their necks, eyes darting toward first class where Ethan sat. Clara Jensen watched the views skyrocket, while also feeling the weight of the stares from those around her. She realized she was no longer just a freelance journalist. She had become the bridge between a small moment inside a cabin and a wave of outrage swelling outside. In the galley, Madeline Grant adjusted her bun. her fingers gripping the serving tray so tightly her knuckles whitened. Snippets of whispers pricked her ears. They're saying he's the CEO of the airline. What if it's true? Did she really shove her own boss down to economy? Each word pierced through the mask of composure she was desperately trying to hold. She forced a smile for passengers, but her eyes betrayed panic. At the Skyreach Operations Center, Owen Park barely blinked as he stared at his screen. Online sentiment charts were speaking. Thousands of tweets carried the hashtags AG417 and rightful seat. One particular comment made his skin crawl. If CEO Ethan Cole is really on this flight, Skyreach is about to face a storm unlike anything it has seen. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Foster received another update from Owen. He clenched his jaw, eyes fixed on the sky ahead. He had flown through storms, managed engine failures, but he had never felt his cabin become the epicenter of a global quake. He exhaled, knowing that his composure was now the only shield protecting the crew. Ethan sat in seat 2A, fingers interlocked. He didn't need to look at his phone to know what was happening outside. He could feel it as surely as a heartbeat. The story had outgrown the seat, outgrown the plane, and was now an indictment of the entire system. And he, through silence, had set it in motion. A young flight attendant, Sophie Delgado, walked quietly down the aisle. She set a bottle of water on Ethan's table and whispered, "Sir, I just want to say that I saw what happened. I'm sorry." Her eyes shone not with pity, but with courage. Ethan gave a small nod. A wordless thank you, but enough for Sophie to understand exactly which side she had chosen. In economy, the video passed from one phone to another. A middle-aged woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Do you see? He hasn't said a word, but everything around him is collapsing." Her husband nodded, eyes still fixed on Ethan. That's not the silence of weakness. That's the silence of power. Meanwhile, in first class, Richard Hawthorne tried to reclaim the air. He launched into a loud story about yachts in Monaco, his booming voice meant to drown out the stares. But the laughter that followed sounded forced, brittle. The harder he tried to project authority, the more obvious his unease became. Madeline approached, pouring more champagne for Richard, clinging to routine as if it could shield her. But when she bent down, her eyes met Ethan's cold, steady gaze. Her hand trembled, and a drop of champagne spilled onto the white cloth. In that instant, she knew. The facade had torn, and everyone could see through. Outside the window, clouds gathered. Inside, the air thickened with anticipation. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. This flight would not be an ordinary one. It had become a stage, and every glance, every phone, every heartbeat was drawn to the man who had been pushed to row 18, only to return to seat 2A. Ethan closed his eyes. He knew that when the plane touched down in Eastport, the masks would fall, and every word, every decision would echo louder than any jet engine. The steady roar of the 787's engines pulsed like the heartbeat of a giant. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer an ordinary flight. It was a ticking bomb, and with every passing second, the pressure built higher. At the Skyreach Airlines Operations Center, Owen Park wiped the sweat beading on his forehead. The screens before him were lit with a flood of red alerts. It was no longer just about a video. The social media analytics system was spiking like a fever. The hashtag #rightful seat had shot to the top of trending in under 40 minutes. Tweets from journalists, attorneys, even politicians were piling in. A special alert flashed across his screen. FAA liaison, requesting live monitoring on AG 417. Owen gripped the keyboard tighter. The Federal Aviation Administration was watching now. That meant every action from this moment on would go into an official record. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Foster received a direct order through the secure line. The voice of the FAA liaison came steady in his headset. "Captain, we've seen the footage. Maintain cabin stability. Upon arrival at Eastport, an observation team will be present at the gate. Prepare your report." Foster answered crisply. "Understood." He cut the line and sat in silence for a moment. Years in the skies had carried him through lightning storms and blizzards. But this storm wasn't outside. It was erupting in his cabin. At the front row, Ethan Cole sat in silence. Outside the window, fragments of cloud streaked past like torn thoughts. He knew the FAA was now involved. He knew the press was circling. When the wheels touched down, every lens would turn toward him. Yet instead of worry, a calm resolve settled over him. This was the moment to strip away the shadows. In the cabin, Clara Jensen kept updating her feed. Her phone buzzed non-stop with messages from editors, colleagues, strangers. "Confirm for us, is the man in the video really Skyreach's CEO? Can you secure an interview the moment you land?" Clara gripped her phone, torn between nerves and exhilaration. She knew the story had outgrown the plane. It was about to become a national headline. In the galley, Madeline Grant stiffly brewed a new pot of coffee, her movements mechanical. She heard the whispers trailing behind her, felt eyes following every gesture. A part of her wanted to snap, to impose order as she always had, but instinct warned her. Any misstep now would only become evidence against her. A few rows away, Sophie Delgado stole a glance at Ethan. A quiet resolve welled inside her. "If the truth is to be spoken, I will be a witness." Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze had never been steadier. In first class, Richard Hawthorne's patience was fraying. He leaned toward the seat beside him, his voice low but sharp enough to carry. "This is absurd. A seat turns into a spectacle. The internet will forget." But when he unlocked his phone, the headlines filled the screen. His own face, sitting in first class, alongside captions fueling the rage of millions. A chill ran down his spine. The closer they drew to Eastport, the tighter the silence wrapped around the cabin. Only the hiss of wind along the wings remained. Inside every mind, the same question echoed. When the doors open, what waits on the other side? Ethan closed his eyes, letting his heartbeat sync with the engine's rhythm. He no longer thought of the seat. He thought of the message. That respect is not a luxury service, but a fundamental right of every passenger. And he knew that when the wheels struck the runway, the world would be forced to hear it from him. The seatbelt sign lit up, a single ding, echoing through the cabin like a bell toll before a storm. The 787 tilted gently, descending. Through the window, thick clouds lifted like a curtain, revealing the pale glow of Eastport in the distance. But inside, the atmosphere was wound so tight it felt as if a single word could shatter it. Ethan Cole sat motionless in seat 2A. His posture was calm, but his silence rippled outward through the rows. Every passenger knew he was the epicenter. They whispered, they stole glances, but he did not respond. Their eyes were needles, and he was the still surface of a lake, concealing an abyss. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Foster exchanged brief words with Eastport Ground Control. A voice came through his headset. "Captain, confirm. FAA, compliance and press are all at Gate B12. Security standing by. Media already present." Foster's grip tightened on the yoke. Never before had he landed into a storm of public scrutiny. He thought to himself, when the doors open, the light will flood in. There will be no shadows left to hide in. At the operations center, Owen Park typed out his final message to Foster. "This flight is no longer just an incident. It will be a test for all of Skyreach. Be ready." His fingers trembled, but his eyes gleamed. He knew he was watching history being written. In the cabin, Clara Jensen stared at her phone. Views had already passed 500,000. The hashtag #rightful seat was now trending #1 nationwide. Messages poured in. "Confirm the CEO's identity." "We need an interview at landing." "Clara, you're in the eye of the storm." "Don't miss it." She drew in a breath and looked toward Ethan. The man had not spoken a word, yet his presence had already said everything. Clara knew that the moment he stepped off the plane, the story would explode. In the galley, Madeline Grant leaned against the steel counter, arms folded. She stared at her reflection in the polished fridge door. Outwardly composed, but her eyes betrayed cracks. She wondered what would await her on the ground. A reprimand, or the end of her career. Pride clashed with fear, and she whispered to herself as if pleading for mercy. It was just a seat. But deep down, she knew it was never just a seat. Sophie Delgado, the young flight attendant, walked past and glanced toward Ethan. A struggle churned inside her. Speak up or remain silent. At last, she leaned in and whispered, "Mr. Cole, I'll testify, if needed." Ethan turned, his eyes glowing with respect. A single nod was enough for Sophie to feel her choice had meaning. In first class, Richard Hawthorne drummed his fingers on the table, his face twisted with irritation. He hated being relegated to a supporting role, hated sitting beside the true center of gravity he could not control. He glanced at Ethan, then back to his phone, where thousands of comments now chanted his name. A name once tied to financial power had become a symbol of selfish privilege. For the first time, Richard felt his seat was not a throne, but a cage. The 787 dipped again. Through the window, the streets and towers of Eastport came into focus. The wheels were preparing to touch down, but everyone's hearts knew the true impact would come when the cabin doors opened. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, gathering his strength. He remembered the young employees who once believed the airline stood for hope. He remembered the passengers who had endured silent disdain, and he knew he would not walk off this plane simply as a CEO. He would step out as living proof that dignity cannot be bought or stolen. A heavy thud echoed as the plane's wheels met the runway. Engines roared, the fuselage shuddered, passengers tilted forward with inertia. But no one clapped as they usually did. No one said, "Safe flight." The cabin remained utterly silent, waiting. And in that silence, everyone understood. This landing was not the end of a flight. It was the opening of a public trial, and the truth would be laid bare at Gate B12. The hum of the engines faded, leaving only the long hiss of the 787 as it rolled along the runway. The cabin lit up with harsh white light, the usual glow after landing, but today it felt more like the floodlights of a courtroom. Every face was illuminated, tense. "Welcome to Eastport," Captain Daniel Foster's voice came over the intercom, steady but heavy. "Please remain seated until the sign is turned off." A ding, but no one moved. There was no rustle of seatbelts unfastening in haste, no chatter of passengers eager to disembark. The cabin was silent, as if everyone knew the next moment would redefine the meaning of the flight. Ethan Cole sat still in seat 2A. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, his gaze fixed on the thin curtain that separated first class from the exit. He could feel the quickened breaths around him. To him, each second of waiting was like the drumbeat of a debut, not as a CEO, but as a witness. Young flight attendant Sophie Delgado stood near the galley, her heart pounding so hard she thought her chest might burst. She looked at Ethan, then at Chief Purser Madeline Grant. Madeline still wore her professional smile, but her fingers were clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew that once the door opened, no smile could conceal the truth. The economy cabin stirred with murmurs. Clara Jensen had her camera ready, lens pointed forward. She knew thousands were watching outside, and millions more would see what came next. Beneath her live stream, comments erupted. Is he really the CEO? How will the FAA handle this? We are watching history. The engines went quiet. The plane stopped at Gate B12. Blue light from outside glinted off the window, revealing the silhouettes of security personnel, compliance officers, and the flash of cameras waiting. A click, the door unlocked. The jet bridge slid into place. The air grew heavier, then burst as the door swung open. The first sound that rushed into the cabin wasn't wind, but noise, the relentless clatter of camera shutters, voices shouting questions, names called out from every direction. "Mr. Cole, what happened on board? Was this discrimination? Are you going to fire anyone?" Passengers held their breath. Some craned their necks to see, others bowed their heads pretending to tie shoelaces. But all were listening. Ethan rose, a simple movement, yet it seemed to draw the entire cabin toward him. He slid his carry-on from the overhead bin and stepped into the aisle. Passengers leaned aside instinctively, creating a narrow passage straight to the door. Madeline stepped out of the way, eyes fixed on the floor. Her silence spoke louder than any excuse. Sophie watched him pass, her chest tight with nerves but her eyes shining with hope. The truth was walking out into the open. As Ethan set foot on the jet bridge, the noise swelled. Flashes burst like hammers striking glass. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised, shouting his name. But Ethan didn't pause. He walked steadily, back straight, gaze locked on the glass doors of the gate. At the terminal, Owen Park from operations was already in place, headset on, tablet in hand. He murmured into the line, "CEO in transit." 30 seconds. His voice was low but firm, like a command rippling through the system. When Ethan stepped into the gate area, the noise erupted into a wave. Cheers, shouts, the explosion of camera shutters. Passengers behind him crowded out, phones held high to record. A man whispered, "We just witnessed history. This wasn't just a flight." Ethan stopped in the middle of the crowd, camera flashes lighting his calm face. He spoke, voice clear and steady. "I will answer 3 questions. Only 3. Then I have work to do." The noise cut off instantly. Reporters raised their hands, microphones pushed forward. A silence fell, sharp and heavy, like the stillness before a storm. And every eye, every lens, every heartbeat waited to hear what the man, who had been pushed down to row 18 and returned to 2A, would say to redefine an entire airline. Camera flashes strobed like lightning in a storm. Passengers crowded inside gate B12. Phones raised high to capture every second. The press swarmed, microphones stacked upon microphones, a forest of them pointed at one man in a simple grey suit, Ethan Cole, CEO of Skyreach Airlines. He raised his hand, his voice cutting through the noise, clear and firm. "I will answer 3 questions, only 3. After that, I have work to do." The bustling space fell silent in an instant. The packed crowd seemed to hold its breath. Only the clatter of camera shutters and the pounding of hearts remained. The first to speak was a local reporter, her voice urgent. "Mr. Cole, when you were moved out of your first-class seat, was that a mistake or was it deliberate?" Ethan met her eyes, his voice steady but unyielding. "It was not a mistake. It was a decision made without process, without legitimate reason. And every passenger, not just me, deserves to be protected from decisions like that." The rapid fire-tapping of keyboards filled the air, camera shutters clicking non-stop. A national journalist pushed forward, microphone trembling in his hand. "Do you believe this incident was related to your race? Were you discriminated against?" Ethan paused for a beat, letting the silence stretch taut. His eyes swept across the crowd before fixing on the lens pointed at him. "I believe assumptions were made about me, assumptions that would not have been made about someone else. And when those assumptions become decisions, we are no longer talking about service. We are talking about prejudice, and prejudice in any form has no place in this industry." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Some nodded firmly, others gripped their phones tighter, knowing those words would spread to millions within the hour. The third question came from the back, Clara Jensen's voice ringing out, steady and sharp. "Then, sir, what happens next?" Every camera turned to Ethan. He didn't hesitate. His voice was low and commanding, each word striking like a gavel. "What happens next is this culture will change, or those who refuse to change will leave." The crowd erupted. The sentence, concise and cutting, burst through the wall of silence in aviation. Reporters shouted for more, but Ethan stepped back, lifting his hand to signal the end. "I said 3 questions, and I keep my word." 2 security officers moved forward, carving a path through the crush of microphones. Reporters shouted his name, passengers cheered, flashes exploded. But Ethan walked on without looking back. His stride was steady, his gaze fixed on the doors leading to the closed conference room. Madeline Grant was held back at a side exit, her eyes wild, shoulders trembling. Meanwhile, Sophie Delgado stood at the edge of the gate, her eyes alight. She knew she had just witnessed a moment that would redefine her career. In the operations center, Owen Park watched the live feed, his heart hammering. He whispered he turned a single seat into a declaration, and now no one can turn their back on the truth. Outside the gate, the crowd of passengers lingered. A middle-aged woman squeezed her son's hand and said softly, "You see, that's why we have to speak up." The boy nodded, his eyes following Ethan as though gazing at a symbol. When the conference room doors shut behind him, the outside world exploded in a storm of headlines. The hashtag rightful seat had already surpassed 1 million mentions. And in everyone's mind, one truth resounded. This was the moment a CEO stood up not for his own seat, but for every passenger's seat. The frosted glass door closed, cutting Ethan off from the roar outside the gate. Inside the emergency conference room, the cold white glow of fluorescent lights fell across a long, dark wooden table. On it sat a water carafe, a handful of hastily printed documents, and a small recorder blinking red. The air was heavy, so still that the tick of the wall clock sounded like a hammer. Owen Park stood against the wall, tablet in hand, his face set in grim lines. Across from Ethan sat Amelia Grant, FAA representative, posture straight, gaze unflinching. Beside her, 2 compliance officers flipped through files with pens poised. The door opened again. Madeline Grant entered, shoulders stiff, a strained smile frozen on her face. Her steps were slow, her eyes evasive. She slid into a seat at the far end of the table, directly across from Ethan. His eyes held steady on her, not angry, not pitying, only reflecting back the truth she wished to hide. "Let's begin." Amelia tapped her pen against the table, her voice clipped. "The incident at Seat 2A has been documented. Images and data have been verified. The first question is for you, Miss Grant. Why was Mr. Cole reassigned from his rightful seat?" Madeline swallowed hard, her smile thinning. "There was a system error. I was only following procedure to prevent a delay." Ethan leaned back, his voice calm but cutting through the air. "There was no error. My ticket was verified twice. I sat in the seat I paid for. What you called procedure was nothing more than a mask for prejudice, and it was exposed in front of every passenger's camera." Owen tapped his tablet, and the screen lit up with video. Madeline holding Ethan's boarding pass, the flicker in her eyes, then the cold smile as she redirected him to economy. The audio was clear. "This seat is reserved for a VIP passenger." The room locked into silence. Madeline's face drained of color. Her voice faltered, no longer polished, but frantic. "Mr. Cole, I didn't know who you were." "I never meant to insult." Ethan tilted his head, his eyes sharp as steel. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't know who I was, and that's why you assumed I didn't belong. This was never about recognizing me as CEO. It was about the fact that any passenger could be treated the way I was if they don't fit your picture of what VIP looks like." Amelia scribbled quickly, her voice clipped and cold. That is sufficient for the FAA to categorize this under discriminatory conduct. The air grew heavier. Ethan leaned forward, his tone steady, precise. I will not allow this to be buried as an isolated incident. Starting today, I require, first, the immediate suspension of Ms. Madeline Grant pending full investigation. Second, a complete internal audit of every seat reassignment case over the last 3 years. Third, mandatory bias training for all senior crew within 30 days. The compliance officer's pens scraped across paper. Owen lifted his head, eyes bright. He knew each word was chiseling itself into policy. Madeline lowered her face, whispering, "You're destroying my career." Ethan's reply rang deep, final, like a gavel. "No, you destroyed it with your choice. I am only ensuring no one else has to endure what I did." The room froze. Even the clock seemed to stop. Then Amelia set her pen down, her voice clear. "The FAA will oversee this closely. If Skyreach fails to comply, we will intervene." Ethan nodded once. "Good. I want transparency, starting from this very moment." Outside, the roar of the press still rolled in like waves. But inside, a decision had been carved sharp as a blade. One man was forced from his seat. One airline was dragged under the spotlight. And an old, rotting culture had just been shattered to make way for something new. The first-class cabin of flight AG-41 blazed with the light of camera flashes. There were no more furtive whispers, no more forced laughter. Only a charged silence, as every eye fixed on one man, Ethan Cole. He stood beside seat 2A. The dark brown leather chair was no longer just a seat. It had become a symbol of exclusion, but also of the affirmation of dignity. Ethan placed his hand on the armrest, his voice ringing clear, carrying to every corner of the cabin. "This is where I was denied. But this is also where we begin again. Because respect is not a privilege, it is a promise." Cameras snapped in rapid succession. Several passengers pressed their hands against their chests, feeling the weight of each word. Ethan turned to Amelia Grant, the FAA representative seated in the front row. "Today I make this commitment. Never again will any seat on Skyreach be reassigned at someone's whim. From this moment on, every decision will be recorded, reviewed, and made public. Transparency is not a choice, it is an obligation." By the galley, Sophie Delgado's heart pounded so hard she had to grip her uniform to steady her hands, yet her eyes glistened with resolve. For the first time in her career, she felt her voice, the voice of younger crew members, being given power. Ethan continued, "We will establish an independent body, the Beacon Council. It will include passenger representatives, the FAA, and employees willing to speak the truth, like Ms. Delgado here." Sophie's throat tightened, tears threatening, but her gaze held firm. The cameras swung to capture the moment, a living testament to courage. In his seat, Richard Hawthorne sat in silence. He twisted the gold ring on his finger, his eyes lowered. Seat 2A had once felt like his throne. Now it had become a pulpit, delivering a lesson even he could not ignore. Ethan faced the cluster of reporters crowding the aisle. His voice dropped lower, yet every word pierced the silence like a needle. I do not stand here to reclaim one seat for myself. I stand here to ensure that every one of you, old or young, wealthy or poor, whatever your skin, whatever your voice, will never again be told you do not deserve to sit in the place you paid for. A smattering of applause came from the rear rows, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted in clapping. Some passengers rose to their feet, eyes shining with tears, not because a CEO had spoken, but because in his words they saw themselves. In every moment of being dismissed, every time they had been pushed aside without recognition. Clara Jensen held her camera steady, her pulse thundering. She knew she was capturing a moment that would air on the evening news, that would one day appear in business history books. The moment a CEO transformed humiliation into a promise of reform. Ethan raised his boarding pass high, his voice resounding, each word like an oath. A seat can be bought, but respect must be defended every single time. Applause thundered, drowning out the cabin announcements. Amelia Grant nodded slowly, writing into the record, "Public commitment." As the flashes softened, Ethan lowered his hand and sat down in the seat 2A. This time, he did not sit as a passenger who had been diminished, but as a leader. The sky beyond the window stretched vast as always, but inside the cabin it felt wider, because a boundary had just been broken. In the world of aviation, people often talk about technology, stronger engines, faster planes, more luxurious services. But Flight AG417 proved a simple truth that many airlines forget. What keeps an airplane steady is not only the lift of its wings, but also the weight of respect. A first-class seat is not just an expensive ticket. It is a promise that every passenger, no matter who they are, has the right to sit in the place they paid for without being judged by prejudice. When that promise is broken, it does not only wound one person, it shakes the trust in the entire system. Ethan Cole did not need to shout, nor did he need to flaunt his authority. He let his silence speak for him, a silence powerful enough to force the world to listen. And when he stood up, not only to reclaim his own seat, but to affirm the rightful place of every passenger, he turned a moment of humiliation into a turning point for an entire culture. The lesson here is not only for aviation. It is for every organization, every community. If you allow prejudice to quietly seep into your processes, sooner or later, truth will come knocking. Not everyone may carry the authority of a CEO. But everyone deserves respect, and anyone can be the witness who forces the system to change. If this story made you reflect, leave a small sign below. A like, a subscribe, or simply 3 words in the comments. Respect first. Because respect is not a luxury, it is the foundation that allows us all to rise higher together.